And hello once again. This is the next lecture episode series thing about literary concepts in general. Today we are looking at intentionalism. Now before I get started, my name is Lupus, and I make these kinds of videos that are sort of going over these kind of literary concepts, and sometimes I make more high production videos, but not at the moment. So at the end of the video, I'll go into some of those other things. But if you are interested in this kind of stuff, you could do the whole like, subscribe, whatever, that stuff. But let's just get underway in intentionalism. So what is intentionalism? Now before actually going into what is intentionalism itself, you first have to ask the question, what is intention? So intention essentially, in very, very, very basic terms, means, what something is supposed to mean, according to the author, according to the person that created whatever it happens to be. Now, intention, you can look at intention from both more of a literary perspective or an ordinary perspective, right? Which we're going to go into that in a while. But think about, in terms of probably one of the easiest areas to think of intention is to think of the criminal justice system. So when it comes to murder, regular murder, as in murder, is basically killing with intent. Whereas manslaughter is killing without intent. So it could be something like accidentally killing someone in self-defense, or accidentally hitting someone with your car, right? Those would be manslaughter. You didn't intend to kill someone. It was not your intention, but it happened. Whereas killing with intent is murder. That's like actually killing someone, like going out of your way, premeditated murder, like wanting to kill them, trying to kill them, right? So that's a very easy way to sort of think of intention, right? It's either what you do want to do versus don't want to do. But now it becomes a bit more confusing when it gets to literary communication. So first, let's just talk about literary versus ordinary communication. Now, intention in terms of murder, that's fine. But what about intention when it comes to literary communication and ordinary communication? Let's first talk about ordinary communication. So ordinary communication is just, talking, like I'm talking to you, you're talking to me, we're having a conversation. Now, miscommunications can happen, where I will say something that maybe I did not, or you misunderstood me. So I did not intend for you to think that what I was saying, but that is what you thought I was saying. So that is, that does happen, and it's easy to correct those usually, right? Sometimes, I'm sure we've all had this happen before, where someone has said something to us that hurt us, but we didn't say anything about it because we didn't want to make a big deal about it. We wanted to just move on. But that person might not have intended to hurt you with what they said. They just said something maybe without thinking, and they hurt you. Now that is part of ordinary communication. That's just conversation, talking, whatever. Sometimes we misunderstand each other. It happens, and also sometimes, of course, say in instances like that, someone might say something without thinking and hurt someone there's all sorts of reasons. They could accidentally hurt you. Maybe they didn't really think about what they were saying. Maybe they didn't actually realize that what they were saying was hurtful. These kind of things can happen, right? However, if you're in an ordinary conversation, you can get somebody to clarify things, right? If I say something and you don't understand, you could say, sorry, what did you just say what I think? And no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. Right? You can do that in a conversation. You can stop someone and say, is that what you meant? And you could say yes or no, right? So your intention is important, because language is a medium through which you can communicate your intent. What do you want to say? What are you trying to say? If somebody misunderstands you, or you phrase it in a way that was poor or anything like that, that becomes a bit of an issue in terms of intent, right? Now, this is still very fine, right? In ordinary communication, what have you, intent is not that difficult. It's not exactly a complicated thing. Did you intend that? No, yes, whatever. When it comes to literary communication, things get a bit more iffy. Now, literary communication, I'm just going to use this as a very, very broad label. So I'm going to also be including basically all forms of art. So you can also think of things like paintings or whatever. What did the person intend with what they created? Now, one of the problems, of course, in terms of this more literary, artistic communication, is that you usually can't ask the person. You can't ask a famous writer what they meant in the book they wrote. And also they might not tell you, even if you got the chance to ask them. So that is what intentionalism is all about, of understanding this, of understanding what did the person intend versus what did they create. Now I'm going to mostly be using literary examples because that is my area, but you can apply this to art in general. So there's three main types: intentionalism, moderate intentionalism, and anti-intentionalism. We're going to go through each of them. So intentionalism is pretty much the idea that what the author means, what they intended, is what the text means. So if I wrote something and I say, this is what it's about, that is what it's about. Which is very, very simple, right? Now that is it's a romantic idea. Romantic as in romanticism, not romantic as in sexy. So romantic, in romanticism, I did do a whole video about romanticism, which I'll put in the description. But now romanticism, very, very broadly, is a literary theory that believes that the author, the person who created the text or the poem, the book, the piece of art, whatever, what they say it is about because it is a reflection. Whatever they create is a reflection of what's inside them, right? And so everything is basically a conscious effort. Everything they put into it was consciously done. So that is where it comes into this intentionalism thing. It's about something being consciously decided, right? So that's where it's saying, listen, if the author says that is what it's about, that is what it's about. Which immediately runs into problems, which we will go into, but this is a very, very simple and very sort of simplistic way of looking at things, of sort of saying that what the author says is correct. Now the thing is, of course, authors can lie. They might not even understand their own work entirely. For instance, there might be unconscious factors at play. Say, let's take a book that has, let's say, sexist or racist depictions in it, right? That person might not consciously be thinking, I'm going to write something racist. But then they use, say, a racist stereotype, a racist caricature, or a sexist one, or whatever. They might themselves, inside, believe, no, I'm not sexist, I am not racist. But then you read it and you go, yeah, but what you wrote seems kind of racist, and if not racist, racially insensitive, or something like that. So you might not even realize your own biases. You might not realize that what you're writing is informed by your culture, informed by your upbringing. There might be parts to how you write that you don't even realize you're doing it. Like, if you, for instance, are writing a book and there's people eating food, right? And now, to somebody who's raised in sort of ordinary society, sort of Western society, you'll just be like, yeah, of course, here's your food, there's some like carbs on the plate, there's maybe rice, pasta, whatever, there's some meat there's some whatever. But now here's the thing, immediately, you've actually made unconscious assumptions about what is okay to eat. Somebody, for instance, who is vegan will immediately notice that there is meat on in that dish, in that story, which immediately implies that the people within that story think it's okay to eat meat. Now, if you don't think about it, or you don't care or whatever, then you might not have even intended that to be a thing, but it is. If you write a story in which characters are big and tough and strong and warriors, you might not even realize that you are perpetuating certain stereotypes, sort of like masculine stereotypes, you might not even realize. So what you intended, you might just think, oh, I was just writing a fun story, but there are unconscious factors at play that you didn't even realize were in there. So then let's go to moderate intentionalism. This is where you're looking on both sides. You're sort of saying, actually maybe it's easier to go straight to anti-intentionalism first, seeing as moderate is in between. So let's first do anti-intentionalism. I think it's quite self-explanatory. It's anti-intentionalist. It believes that the author's intentions do not matter. Now I've put a thing here called death of the author. Death of the author is a concept that was, it's an essay by Roland Barthes. And actually there is also a Anglo-American New Criticism concept called the intentional fallacy, which is very, very similar. They're both basically like very, very similar to each other, but Death of the Author is more famous. Probably because Roland Barthes is more famous than Wimsatt and Beardsley, who were the two people that wrote about the intentional fallacy. So Death of the Author basically is saying that you do not know what the author intended. It's easy, say, now, when somebody is alive, to say, what did you mean by that book you wrote? What characters, what did they mean? What were you intending? That's easy to do that. That's fine. We can't ask Shakespeare. We can't go back in time and be like, Jane Austen, would you comment on your characters and tell us? We can't ask, and also they might not tell. You get some contemporary writers who refuse to talk about what their work means. Someone like J.M. Coetzee. So a lot of the more academic writers and what have you don't really talk about what their story is about on a deeper level, because they want you to figure that out. If you read something like J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, if you have no understanding of, that sounds a bit mean, if you're just unaware of certain parts of, say, colonial history, you might not fully understand the story. You might take something else away from it. So, but that doesn't mean your interpretation was wrong. It just means you had a different interpretation. So, Death of the Author is saying, listen, it doesn't actually matter what the author says. The author can shout till blue in the face, being like, oh, this is what my story means. But if you get something else out of it, you're not wrong. Now, you could also then say that basically the author, yes, they did create it, but they're actually kind of another reader, in a sense, because they have their own interpretation. What the author thinks their book is about, or their poem, or their song, or whatever, is not the same as what you think it's about. So, Death of the Author is basically saying that we need to metaphorically kill the author. We need to say, the author doesn't matter. Do not analyze a text according to what you think the author meant, because it doesn't matter. What matters is what the text itself says. So if this intentionalism is focused on the sender, on saying we need to pay attention to the author, anti-intentionalism is saying we need to pay attention to the text. Who cares what the author says? What matters is what their text says. That is the only thing we can be certain of. The only thing we know for sure is that this poem exists. We don't know what the author meant by the poem. And it doesn't matter, because it's up to us to interpret it, not up to the author. The point of the author is to create a thing, put it into the world for us to then interpret and understand. That is the point of us in this transaction. So, intentionalism, what the author says goes. Anti-intentionalism, who cares about the author, only pay attention to the text. Now, when it comes to certain literary theories, intentionalism is very, very much a romantic idea, whereas anti-intentionalism is things like Russian formalism, Anglo-American New Criticism. Anti-intentionalism will also be things like reader response theory, because we don't care what the author says. It's only what we say, how we interpret it, or whatever. So that is anti-intentionalism. So, right, pay attention to the author versus pay attention to the text. Then you get moderate intentionalism, which quite simply is between the two. It's sort of saying, well, we don't know completely what the author means, but we could. What if there are interviews with the author? It's also not just that. It could also be other things. So, for instance, moderate intentionalism would also care about the context in which something occurred. One of the things about anti-intentionalism, one of the issues, is that it doesn't pay attention to context. So let's say if you were to, let's just say, pick up a famous bad book. And when I say bad, I don't mean like badly written. I mean like a book that is considered to be morally bad. So let's take, for instance, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, which is generally considered to be a unethical and bad book. It's not considered to be a good thing. So if we were to say anti-intentionalism, we would ignore the fact that it was written by Hitler. You would just say, no, don't pay attention to the fact it was written by Hitler. Let's just read what it says. And then you would read it and be like, this is very racist. But you wouldn't pay attention to it. Now, if you were saying intentionalism, you would be saying, well, what did Hitler intend with it? Which also you don't know, because we can't look into the mind of him. He's dead. Moderate intentionalism would be more like, let's look at both sides. What does the text actually say? But let's also look at the context in which it took place. Who wrote Mein Kampf? Why did he write Mein Kampf? And then what happened because of the publication of that book? That book led to the rise of the Nazi regime, or what was one of the contributing factors to the rise of the Nazis. So that is kind of important context. If you're just ignoring that completely in terms of anti-intentionalism, then you're ignoring like a whole thing. It could also be, say, let's take a piece of fiction, because Mein Kampf is a piece of political theory. Let's take a very, very racist book. Now, this is not that famous to people who aren't in the know, but there is a very famous and morally very, very wrong book called The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries is basically a very, very violent, white supremacist, awful piece of filth, basically. Now, if we were to look at it from all three of these perspectives, intentionalism, well, we can't know the intentions directly, but seeing as the guy who wrote it was a white supremacist, his intention with this racist book was probably to try to suggest a certain idea. He was probably trying to suggest that certain races are better than others. That was probably his intention. But you see, I had to use the word probably, because it is possible that somebody could write something super racist and that wasn't their intention. I mean, it's possible. It would be very weird if that happened, but it's possible. So we can sort of see what the intentions are, but we don't know for sure. If we went anti-intentionalist, we would ignore the fact that this guy is a white supremacist. We would ignore the socio-cultural sort of aspect that is white supremacy in general and just read the book for what it is. Then you'd sort of go, this book hates certain people, but it's a book. Whereas moderate intentionalists would say, we need to look at the context. This book, yeah, sure, it's a book. We can't know the intentions, definitely. We know what the text is. The text itself is racist. However, what we do know is that this book, the Turner Diaries, has been used by a lot of white supremacists as like a very, very important book. They love this book. So this book probably shouldn't be one that we pretend is a good thing. Moderate intentionalism is saying, look at both sides. We look at the text, and we look at the author, and the context in general. Don't just look at the author, you look at the history of the period in which it was written. You can only truly understand, say, the works of, like, say, Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Now, when she published it, I can't remember if it was anonymous or if it was under a man's name, but it wasn't under her own name. And that's because when that was published, woman wouldn't really be taken seriously. If a book was published by a woman, it wouldn't be taken seriously. Right? This is also why Jane Austen also, I think, published under a man's name at first, and you get a couple of people who basically publish under male names because they wanted to be taken seriously. Now, today, you wouldn't do that. I mean, you could publish under whatever gender name, it doesn't matter. But back then, it was a necessity. Because back then, the only books that were written by women were like romances. So if you wanted to write something that wasn't that, and you wanted people to actually take it seriously, you had to basically lie. Which is terrible. But that, in terms of moderate intentionalism, you need to understand the world in which those women lived, in which they felt that that was necessary to do. So that is completely different to like now. You need to understand the world in which Jane Austen lived to fully understand her work. In that sense. So that would be a moderate intentionalist approach. So you see, very, very basic. Right? Intentionalism, what did the author intend? Anti-intentionalism, let's just look at the text. Moderate intentionalism, let's look at the context, the author, and the text. Let's look at it all, everything. Right? So that's quite simple. I hope that this has been quite a simple explanation of what intentionalism is. But lastly, what even is an author? Just end off on this. Now this goes into sort of philosophical areas of what it means to have authorship. Now, Michel Foucault wrote about this as well, in the idea that there are sort of these ideas around the ideal author and the real author, and also the ideal reader and all these kind of things. But what actually is an author? Is the author the person that has all the meaning? Is it all in here? Or is the author conveying part of their culture rather than necessarily conveying directly what's in their own brain? Because yeah, sure, they are conveying what's in their mind, but are they fully conveying that? Or are they also conveying the situation in which they lived? Right? Which is an interesting thing to think about. Like, this goes into ideas of things like free will. Because when you're writing something, is it completely you who is writing? Or is it also your childhood that's working through you? Is it the culture you live in? Is it also the country you live in, which informs how you think about things? The political beliefs that you hold, which might have an unconscious effect on what you do. All of these could play a role in what is an author. And then also, actually, another thing which is just a bit of like an irritating extra thing, is that when we like to say this whole, what the author intended by their book nowadays. So yes, when he or she was writing this book, blah, 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 this is what they meant. However, the modern publication industry, the author is not the full, well, the writer, let's just say the writer, is not the person who gets full say over things. There might be edits made. There might be entire sections that are taken out because the publisher says no. So the intention of the author is being altered because of business. And in that case, can you still really say completely that it is definitely the full vision of this person that is the book, That becomes a more complicated thing. And that's why anti-intentionalism is very, very useful, right? Because you want to be able to look at a text completely. But moderate intentionalism is also very good because you get to sort of say, I'm going to look at the text itself, what does it say? But I'm also going to look at the context. I would personally say intentionalism is kind of dumb. Intentionalism, you can't know what the author thought. You can't. If you are a creative person, like I'm a writer as well, we tend to like to think that when we write something, we mean this. But you might not fully understand yourself. So you might not even realize exactly what you're writing. You might not realize that, say, your culture, or your childhood, or your parents' voices are talking through you. You might not even realize that. It's an unconscious thing. So intentionalism is not really the best sort of idea. You could argue for it, but it's a very difficult one to argue for because you can't know what the you can't read my mind. You can't read the mind of any author and fully understand. And if an author cannot fully understand themselves, then nobody else is going to understand them either. And also just as a quick aside, if you want to sort of argue something like, oh no, well, obviously everyone knows themselves. If that was true, therapy wouldn't exist, right? We don't really understand ourselves. We understand ourselves as best as we can, and then we need to try to understand ourselves further and improve ourselves and blah, 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 blah. There's all sorts of things, right? But that's a difficult situation. We do not fully understand ourselves, and other people do not fully understand us. Like, there's no way to fully understand the self. It's kind of impossible. So the idea that intentionalism is true is kind of not really backed up by anything. It's very sort of wishy-washy and spiritual, sort of claiming that, oh, there's something special and magical about an author that lets them have this specific intention that was very, very consciously decided. But anyway, and that is intentionalism. Hopefully this did make sense and was understandable and whatever. So yeah, that will be the end of this. Now, if you are interested or if you enjoyed this, do the like, comment, subscribe, share stuff, the usual YouTube things. Also, you can check in the description for me on Twitter and whatever. Otherwise, if you want to support what I do in general, you can check out my books. There's currently 2 published books that you can check out. One I'm going to put over here called The Cyborg Wilderness, and then Mostly Rejected, which is the latest one. Came out not very long ago. Now, the first one is a experimental prose thing, and the second one is a short story collection. You can find more details below. And I think that then is everything. So I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and goodbye.